That morning began with a sharp slicing sound, the crack of a slap snapping against the marble steps in front of Ridgeview Federal Court, loud enough to startle a few sparrows perched on the glass roof into scattering. No one could have imagined that the person struck so hard. Her face twisted to the side was a middle-aged woman who had been walking calmly just seconds before. Judge Alicia Grant, in her simple gray coat and the worn briefcase she had carried for more than 20 years, was now thrown back toward the steel railing, her hair shaken loose and messy, her breath broken. And facing her stood Officer Daniel Brooks, chest-heaving eyes filled with that primitive contempt often found in those too comfortable with privilege. In that moment, Alicia's entire world shrank to nothing but the ringing in her ears and the metallic taste of blood at the corner of her mouth. She was not someone who lost composure easily, but that slap was not mere violence. It was a cold declaration that she was being treated as something lesser. Brooks grabbed her collar and yanked her up, the clang of metal cuffs striking together, echoing like a command. Another officer behind him raised his phone to record eyes gleaming with amusement, as if he were witnessing a performance for entertainment. Alicia felt the humiliation pressing into every cell, yet deep in her chest. A stillness she had cultivated through more than 2 decades in the judiciary held her steady. She kept her gaze fixed unblinking on the glass doors of the court. Just 20 steps away, the brass plaque engraved with courtroom number 3 presiding Judge Alicia M. Grant gleamed under the morning sun. She was standing right outside her own domain, the place where she had sentenced abusers of power exactly like Brooks, and yet today she was being dragged like a petty criminal. The shame cut far deeper than the slap. Brooks tightened the cuffs around her wrists until the metal bit into her skin, then spoke into her ear with poisonous intent, telling her that people like her belonged outside these walls, not walking through them. Around them, other officers smirked, while a few courthouse employees arriving for their shift looked on with indifferent eyes. They saw a harsh truth laid bare that sometimes indifference kills justice before any blow ever lands. Alicia wanted to say something, perhaps ask why, perhaps fight back. But her heart told her to stay silent. That silence was not weakness. It was recognition that any word spoken now would be meaningless. The truth would be revealed when the time was right. All she needed was calm and a sharp mind. She understood the law better than anyone here, including those who believed they were applying it correctly as they abused it against her. Brooks dragged her toward the courthouse entrance with deliberate brutality, as if displaying dominance, but what frustrated him was her eyes. They showed no fear, no pleading, only composure, and something that resembled waiting. He did not realize that this was what unsettled him. A flicker of doubt he tried to bury beneath arrogance. In Alicia's mind, images overlapped the trials she had presided over, the oaths she had taken the victims who had stood trembling before her because of people like Brooks. They shook. She stood for truth. And now she was one of them in the very setting she had defended countless times. It was cruel, painful, ironic, but also unmistakably prophetic. When Brooks shoved her through the glass doors, a cold gust swept through the hallway. Alicia lifted her head one last time toward the court's facade, the place to which she had given nearly half her life. The throbbing on her cheek seemed to whisper that today's humiliation would not end here. There would be a shift. There would be a moment when the dismissed becomes the one standing above the rest. And Alicia knew better than anyone that moment was coming very soon. Part 2 began the moment the courtroom door closed behind Alicia, the metallic thud echoing with a cold resonance, as if the entire building were conspiring with the fabricated story Officer Daniel Brooks was about to present. The air in the courtroom was strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that belonged to a place that had heard far too many lies and far too little truth. Temporary Judge Harold Pierce, with thinning silver hair and eyes dulled by years of repetitive cases, sat confidently at the bench as though he already knew who the supposed wrongdoer was. Brooks adjusted the badge on his chest, straightened his posture, and spoke with smug certainty. He claimed he had been performing a security check when he discovered a suspicious woman attempting to access a restricted area. He described Alicia as combative, uncooperative, spewing threats and insults at law enforcement. Every word, every breath was calculated, performed like a seasoned actor in a play he had rehearsed many times. Alicia sat at the defendant's table, hands cuffed neatly in front of her. Her cheek was still swollen, a red streak trailing from her temple to her jaw. Despite the pain, her expression remained calm, so calm that even the two officers standing behind her seemed unsettled. She did not object, did not interrupt, did not make a sound. It all had one purpose: to let them speak, fully, speak confidently, speak themselves into the perfect trap. Sometimes silence creates a snare sharper than any argument. Pierce nodded along, his trust in Brooks growing with every sentence. He looked at Alicia with the eyes of someone who had already decided the verdict before the hearing began. And in that look, something inside Alicia tightened, not from humiliation, but from the painful realization that the system she had served held far too many people eager to believe a badge rather than justice. When Pierce asked whether anyone had witnessed the incident, Officer Raul Diaz stood up. His voice flowed smoothly, as if rehearsed. He claimed Brooks had used only minimal necessary force, that Alicia had been acting erratically, that she might have been carrying illicit documents. He did not blink once. Officer Mark Turner stood next, adding more fabricated details, building the image of a dangerous, defiant, deceitful woman. Everyone in the courtroom except Alicia believed them. A shallow, absurdly easy kind of belief. But it was precisely that ease that made the lie so glaringly obvious. They had no idea that the woman before them had signed thousands of judgments, corrected countless misconducted officials, and saved an entire judicial district from collapse with her precise rulings. They looked at her without seeing her. When Brooks played the so-called video evidence, a recording that conveniently began halfway through the altercation, Alicia simply watched. She studied every face in the room. Prosecutor Sandra Klein, frowning in a way that favored Brooks Judge Pierce, tilting his head with sympathetic concern for the officers, several court employees avoiding Alicia's eyes as if afraid to recognize something they should not ignore. But one pair of eyes was different. In the back row, Emily Rhodes, the young court clerk, narrowed her gaze at Alicia, her mind spinning quickly. Something in the way Alicia was described in the tone of the accusations reminded Emily of internal meetings of sharp comments she had heard in past years. A strange but powerful intuition stirred within her. Meanwhile, beside the defendant's table, Brooks looked at Alicia, the corner of his mouth lifting in a victorious smirk. He believed he had already won. He believed no one in this room would think a woman of color in plain clothes could be someone of real authority. He believed this hearing would end swiftly, just like the many times he had manipulated situations before. But there was one thing Brooks could never anticipate. Every lie he had just spoken with such confidence was about to become the heaviest indictment of his own life, and the woman sitting there treated like a criminal was the last person he should have crossed. The truth was still quiet in this room, but it was waking, and once it rose, nothing would ever be the same. Part 3 began with an unusual silence, a silence so heavy it felt as if every breath in the courtroom had been suspended midair. When Judge Harold Pierce finished asking Alicia Grant to speak, no one expected the woman in handcuffs at the defendant's table to rise with the composure of someone who fully controlled the atmosphere around her. But Alicia stood slowly, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the bench. The slight lift of her chin, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the absence of any trembling in her shoulders, all of it made the room fall even quieter, as though everyone had suddenly noticed something that did not add up. Alicia's voice emerged not loud, but clear enough to touch every person and every wall. A voice familiar to anyone who had ever heard her icy, sharp rulings, yet today it came from the position of a defendant. She began by thanking the court for allowing her to speak, her tone gentle, but carrying an inexplicable force, like a tense string pulled to its limit. She did not deny, did not justify, she analyzed. She dissected each of Brooks's statements with the calm precision of someone who understood the law better than anyone in the room. Alicia pointed out that at the time of the arrest, she was on a public sidewalk, a location that legally could not be considered a restricted federal area. She referenced the regulations governing lawful passage enough to make Prosecutor Klein narrow her eyes in surprise. Then came the issue of the suspicious documents. Alicia requested a review of every sheet Brooks had labeled as stolen. Her voice hardened like steel as she stated they were legal memos, work schedules, and internal communications issued directly from the courthouse office. A few people shifted uneasily. In the back row, Emily Rhodes sat upright, eyes widening. She had prepared those very kinds of memos, and the tone Alicia was using was the tone of someone who had once supervised her, someone who had signed off on every document. Alicia continued, her voice, now sharper, the blade fully unsheathed. She referenced the Fifth Amendment, the right to silence the right against self-incrimination. She emphasized that anything she might have said under physical assault could not legally be interpreted as aggression. That confidence made Brooks tense, a frown carving into his face. He was beginning to realize something was wrong. A suspicious woman did not speak like this. An ordinary person did not speak like this. Her voice was too exact, too practiced, too professional. Pierce leaned slightly forward. He had heard thousands of defenses, but something in Alicia's tone pulled him out of his 10-year routine. Why would a woman in simple clothes understand the judicial system with such precision? Why could she cite the exact clauses usually reserved for judges? Alicia paused, sweeping her gaze across the room, evaluating which faces understood and which remained buried in bias. Then she reached the most critical point, the cameras. She stated clearly, with the sharp authority of someone used to issuing directives, that this courthouse was equipped with high-resolution surveillance cameras positioned 15 feet apart, capturing the entire area in front of the entrance. According to evidence preservation policy, the court had both the right and the obligation to request all footage. The room stirred. Several court staff exchanged looks. They knew Alicia was telling the truth. They had inspected those cameras every morning. Brooks stiffened. A vein pulsed in his neck. He shot a warning glance at Turner and Diaz, silently urging them to stay quiet. But that gesture only made him look guiltier. Alicia was not finished. She demanded preservation of all body cam footage automatically backed up by police cloud systems, even though Brooks insisted his body cam had malfunctioned. She reminded them of federal requirements mandating 60-second cloud backups, a detail that, if Brooks had forgotten, was now tightening around his neck. The entire room felt the shift. No one saw Alicia as a troublemaker anymore. No one could deny that this tone, this reasoning, this mastery of the law could not possibly belong to an ordinary citizen. Even Prosecutor Klein held her breath. Judge Pierce's frown deepened. Emily was almost certain now she had heard that voice hundreds of times in closed-door meetings, in late-night file reviews, in every quiet approval that determined the fate of cases. Alicia Grant was not an unknown woman, and what Brooks believed was a hunt had already begun transforming into the trap he had walked into himself. The truth was rising slow but unstoppable. Part 4 opened in an atmosphere so thick that anyone standing in the courtroom for even a few seconds could feel their skin tighten from the tension. After Alicia Grant finished speaking, nothing moved according to the system's usual momentum. Brooks's earlier confidence began to crack, and Pierce, who had been sitting on the bench as if he held absolute authority, now faltered, leaning forward slightly, his eyes no longer certain. And as that surface of power wavered, the hidden pieces of truth started sliding into place. In the last row, Emily Rhodes felt a strange chill run down her spine. She was not easily shaken at work, but Alicia's voice, the way she cited regulations, the way she analyzed each clause, even the cadence, right before she made a formal request, all of it was too familiar. Emily had spent hundreds of hours in the fourth-floor office suite right next to Judge Grant's chambers, listening to meetings approvals and quiet directives. She had once told a friend that Judge Grant's voice was like a thin blade gliding through water, soft but capable of cutting anything. And now, that very voice was coming from a woman in handcuffs. Emily studied Alicia carefully. The natural curls of her dark hair, her slender frame standing straight like someone accustomed to giving direction. The bruise on her left cheek made her face look different, the eyes slightly deeper under the cold lights. But there was something, a posture Emily had seen every morning as Judge Grant walked down the hallway, a kind of calm not born from endurance, but from gathering truth. Emily was not the only one noticing. Bailiff Tom Henderson, standing near the back door, suddenly froze mid-gesture as he adjusted his microphone. His eyes narrowed, trying to focus on the woman being treated like a criminal. He had worked in this courthouse for more than 20 years and had never misidentified a judge. But what struck him was not just Alicia's face. It was the way she rotated her wrists subtly to ease the pressure from the cuffs, the same motion someone would make after adjusting the sleeves of a robe worn thousands of times. Cold sweat broke across Henderson's back. He glanced at the large name plaque near the clerk's desk. This hearing was taking place in courtroom number 3. Judge Grant's chambers were only 2 doors away. A horrifying thought crept into his mind. Could it be? He looked at Alicia again, and this time he knew. Those eyes, that presence, the proud lift of her chin, there was no mistaking her. She was the judge he respected most in the entire building. His heartbeat tightened painfully as he realized Brooks had not just assaulted an innocent woman, he had assaulted the presiding judge of this courthouse. The truth nearly buckled his knees. Meanwhile, Brooks, unaware of the invisible threads tightening around him, still stood with the arrogance of a man convinced he had already won. He looked at Alicia with the eyes of a predator accustomed to sensing fear. But what he saw was unsettling, a calm so deep and so certain, it no longer resembled submission. It resembled someone waiting for the perfect moment to flip the very table he stood on. Pierce sensed the shift in the room. He cleared his throat, trying to reclaim authority. He asked Alicia one final question, whether she had any evidence beyond the analysis she had presented. Alicia did not answer immediately. She let her gaze travel across the courtroom as if assessing who fully grasped the situation. At that precise moment, Henderson could no longer endure it. He walked straight to Judge Pierce's bench, leaned close to his ear, and whispered, his voice trembling so badly it was barely audible. Pierce's complexion drained in seconds. He lifted his head to look at Alicia, eyes widening, as if staring at a ghost risen from the foundations of the justice system. Simultaneously, Emily shot to her feet. She did not say a word, but her expression said everything. Alicia was not the subject of this investigation. Alicia was the one who commanded this entire place. Within seconds, the courtroom shifted from suspicion to shock. Sandra Klein turned her head repeatedly between Alicia and Pierce. Diaz and Turner froze like carved wood. Brooks held on to his smile, but the corner of his mouth began to twitch a tiny tell, signaling he finally sensed the fracture he could not control. Alicia did not smile, did not look triumphant. She merely tilted her head slightly, her gaze deep and steady, enough to make Brooks shiver. It was the look of someone who knew that from this moment forward, the only question left was whether truth would rise gently or erupt like a storm that would wipe out his entire life. The plot twist had surfaced powerful enough to shatter every lie constructed since the morning began. Part 5 opened in the small waiting room behind the courtroom, where dim yellow light washed over cold white walls. The noisy chaos of the courtroom was gone. The prying eyes were gone, leaving only the steady breathing of Alicia Grant, a breath full of control, layered with anger, sharpened like a blade, sheathed beneath calm. Bailiff Tom Henderson stood before her, his hands still trembling slightly. He had never seen himself lose composure in front of a judge, but the shock of what had happened had frozen his entire body. His voice came out rough and nearly breaking as he whispered, "Judge Grant, I did not recognize you. I am sorry. I am so sorry for letting this happen." Alicia placed her hand on the table, not speaking immediately. Her silence did not carry blame. It carried grounding, the quiet steadiness of someone who had weathered storms far greater than this. Finally, she looked at Henderson, not angry, but with a seriousness that made him straighten like a young recruit before a commanding officer. "You are not the one who caused this," Alicia said slowly. "You simply became a witness to something the system has allowed to rot for far too long." Her words made Henderson bow his head. He blamed himself for not recognizing her sooner, but now his purpose was clear. He inhaled deeply and asked Judge, "What do you need me to do?" Alicia did not hesitate. Her voice became sharp. The mask of calm replaced by the authority of someone used to running an entire judicial building. "Go to my chambers, open the wooden cabinet beneath the bookshelf. Inside you will find my robe and my gavel. Bring them here. And remember, let no one see you." Henderson nodded and hurried out of the room with a pace he had not used since he was young. When the door closed, the room went so silent Alicia could hear her heartbeat, strong, steady, and intentional. She placed both hands on the table and closed her eyes. For a brief moment, her mind returned to every morning she had stepped into a courtroom where every ruling had been weighed with responsibility and conscience. She remembered late nights, sensitive cases, threats sent to her home. None of it had broken her. But this morning, a single slap from an abusive officer had struck at the core of her duty, the duty to protect justice from the corruption that justice itself sometimes shelters. Her phone, returned to her by a court clerk, vibrated nonstop. Messages from her personal clerk, Janet Morrison, filled the screen. "Judge Grant, where are you? The Peterson hearing is about to start. I heard something happened at the main entrance. Please, call me." Alicia did not reply. Instead, she opened her contacts and selected Chief Judge Margaret Ellis. The call was answered after one ring. Margaret's voice tight with worry. "Alicia, what is happening at the courthouse?" Alicia recounted everything concise and plain, but enough to leave Chief Judge Ellis silent for 10 full seconds. Then Margaret spoke, her voice low and simmering with anger. "Alicia, what do you need me to do? I need you to immediately order preservation of all surveillance footage from 8:45 to 9:15. Alicia said each word landing with the finality of a hammer. "Body cams too, and the police department's cloud backups. And Margaret, one more thing. Say it. Order a full review of every case Officer Brooks has touched in the past 5 years. Every report, every statement, every record." Margaret exhaled sharply as if realizing this incident was not just a slap, but a rupture exposing an entire structure of decay. "I will begin immediately. And Alicia, you cannot preside over this hearing conflict of interest." Alicia allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. "You will understand soon enough, Margaret." The door burst open. Henderson returned, holding the neatly folded black robe and the polished walnut gavel. His eyes carried reverence and the sense that he was part of a defining moment in his life. Alicia rose and slowly draped the robe across her shoulders. The weight of the fabric settled against her back like a return to the authority stolen from her that morning. She took the gavel, feeling its familiar heft in her hand. Henderson asked, voice trembling but resolute. "Judge, how should I announce you when you return to the courtroom?" Alicia lifted her chin. "The Honorable Judge Alicia Grant." In that moment, the air in the room seemed to crack open. Revealing a truth no one could ignore, justice was coming back into the room, and this time it was not returning simply to pass judgment, but to overturn an entire system that had forgotten its limits. Part 6 began when the courtroom doors opened once more, but this time not with chaos or noise, instead with an absolute silence so deep that even the faint vibration of metal inside the air conditioner could be heard. Everyone rose instinctively at the commanding voice of Bailiff Henderson, a voice filled with an authority he had only ever used for one person in this entire building. The Ridgeview Federal Court is now in session. Presiding the Honorable Judge Alicia Grant. Her name dropped into the courtroom like a bolt of lightning striking the center of every lie that had been spoken. People jerked upright. Several court staff nearly dropped the papers in their hands. Emily Rhodes brought a hand to her mouth, eyes widening until they reddened. Prosecutor Sandra Klein lost balance, slightly gripping the table for support. And Officer Brooks, he froze. Alicia appeared at the back entrance, the entrance only judges were permitted to use, wearing her familiar black robe, its silk trim flowing with each deliberate step. The overhead lights cast soft illumination along the pleats of her robe, making the fabric seem almost alive with authority. In her right hand, she held her walnut gavel, the gift from her swearing-in ceremony 10 years ago. In that single moment, every position of power in the room realigned. Alicia did not look at anyone immediately. She walked straight to the bench, her steps light but precise, as if the very ground beneath her had known its rightful owner was returning. When she sat in the judge's chair, the same chair she had been dragged away from by a slap, earlier that morning, the entire room seemed to bow under the weight of justice reclaiming its place. Henderson looked at Brooks, his voice sharp as cold steel. "Officer Brooks, stand." Brooks obeyed, but his legs trembled violently, the arrogance he had flaunted earlier dissolving like ash. Seeing Alicia seated in her rightful position drained the air from his lungs. His face turned, white eyes scrambling for a way out, but there was no corner of this room that could save him now. Judge Pierce, who had been sitting in Alicia's seat just minutes before, looked like a schoolboy caught doing something unforgivable. He scrambled to his feet, stammering apologies and requesting to withdraw from the case. Alicia gave a small nod, permitting him to leave. Pierce moved so quickly it seemed he feared the room might swallow him whole if he stayed another second. Alicia straightened her posture and regarded Brooks with an expression that was not angry, but impossibly heavy, the look of someone who had seen too much wrongdoing and no longer had tolerance for anyone who used their power to harm. "Officer Brooks." Alicia said, her voice ringing clear like a bronze bell. "Do you recall the words you spoke in this courtroom before I returned?" Brooks opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Alicia did not need him to answer. She turned to Henderson. "Please read the stenographed statements." Henderson unfolded the document. His voice was steady, slow, and resonant. "People like her always pretend to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid responsibility. I used minimal force. She was the aggressor. She had suspicious documents. Everyone heard it, every word of contempt, dripping from his earlier testimony. And so did Brooks." Alicia tilted her head slightly, the corner of her lips lifting not in amusement, but like someone opening the door to an inevitable reckoning. "Very well," Alicia said. "Now it is my turn." She pressed a button on the bench. The large screen behind her flickered on, displaying footage from the courthouse surveillance cameras. The entire room held its breath. The video showed Alicia in civilian clothes approaching the courthouse peacefully, then Brooks blocking her path, then the slap, then the chokehold, then his voice captured clearly, "Filthy animals, like you belong in cages." A wave of horrified murmurs rippled through the room. Emily clutched her chest, eyes welling with tears. Sandra Klein stepped back as if witnessing a violent crash. Diaz and Turner stiffened like statues. There was nothing left to cling to, no lie that could survive the evidence lighting up the screen. Alicia remained perfectly still. But in her eyes, calm to the point of frost, was the truth she had known all along, the truth that demanded to be seen. And inside the very room Brooks had believed he controlled the truth, was now the only authority present. Fear grew in Brooks's eyes, expanding like a shadow, because he finally understood the most devastating part. He had not only attacked a woman, he had attacked justice itself. And now justice was sitting before him, alive, robed in black, holding a gavel. And the real judgment had only just begun. Part 7 began the moment the screen went dark again, leaving behind a silence so deep, it felt as if the fear of those who had sided with Brooks had taken on a physical form. But Alicia Grant did not allow that silence to linger. She tapped lightly on the bench, signaling Henderson to play the second portion of the evidence, the portion Brooks had believed was buried forever. The screen lit up again. This time it was not courthouse security footage, but the automatic cloud backup from Brooks's body cam, restored exactly as required by the 60-second upload protocol he had conveniently forgotten. In the clip, Brooks's voice rang out clearly, unedited, undeniable. Just look at her. You can tell exactly what type she is. Who does she think she is, walking into a courthouse time to teach another lesson? Each word sliced through the swagger he had worn so proudly that morning. Brooks staggered back a step, his lips trembling. His eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but the same faces that had nodded along earlier were now pale or staring at the floor. Alicia observed the reactions, with eyes sharp as tempered glass. There was no satisfaction, no vengeance, only the cold certainty of someone who had waited far too long for the truth to reveal itself from the liar's own mouth. She signaled for the next clip. The screen displayed the audio logged from Officer Mark Turner's body cam, capturing his mocking chuckle as he watched Brooks attack Alicia. Well, Brooks is in the mood again. She thinks she's somebody important. Then came Diaz's voice, responding, "Important. Look at her. Probably another welfare queen. Brooks knows what he's doing." The courtroom erupted in sharp gasps. Half the people in the room could not believe what they were hearing. The other half realized they were witnessing something they would never forget, for as long as they lived the kind of truth so raw and damning, it stripped away every mask. Alicia folded her hands on the bench, her breathing steady like someone who had simply performed a routine task. She turned her gaze toward Diaz and Turner. They looked as if they had been nailed to the floor, every bead of sweat dropping in rhythm with the chaos inside their chests. Alicia asked one quiet question, her voice soft, but carrying a weight that crushed every excuse before it could be spoken. "Would either of you like to revise your testimony?" The room froze. Turner opened his mouth, but the sound died in his throat. Diaz tried to step forward, but his legs refused to move. Neither dared look at Alicia. Neither dared look at Brooks, who now seemed on the edge of collapsing. Alicia nodded once. She did not need their answer. Their terror was answer enough. Then she turned to Brooks. For the first time that morning, Alicia stood. Her black robe fell along her frame, its folds sharp like the blade of a verdict. Every gaze in the courtroom snapped toward her, even those who had still doubted her identity minutes earlier. Alicia stepped to the edge of the bench, closing the distance between her and Brooks to only a few meters, just enough for him to hear the frantic beating of his own heart. "Officer Brooks," Alicia said, "you came into this courtroom believing the system would swallow your story whole. You believed the badge on your chest held more power than the truth. You believed others would close their eyes and trust your word, just as they have in dozens of incidents before this one." Brooks bit his lip until it bled. He was no longer the man who swaggered in that morning. He was nothing but a trembling shell, watching his career burn down around him. Alicia locked her eyes on his and spoke slowly, each word striking the floor like a hammer. "But there is one thing you did not know. The woman you hit this morning, the woman you insulted, the woman you handcuffed at the courthouse door is the highest authority in this room." The entire courtroom inhaled sharply at the same time. The plot twist burst open, powerful enough to shake even those who had suspected it. Alicia returned to her seat on the bench, placed the gavel before her, and delivered one final sentence, a sentence that froze the entire room in place. Now it is time for justice to answer you, Officer Brooks. One short line, but enough to seal the fate of the man who had dragged himself into the very downfall he now faced. Part 8 opened as Alicia Grant resumed her place on the bench, her gaze sharpened, as though it had just been reforged in the fire of truth. The courtroom was so quiet that even a single heavy breath felt like an offense. Brooks could not stand still. His hands clenched tight. His eyes lost the look of a man stripped bare of the power he once believed was untouchable. Alicia placed both hands on the bench and leaned forward slightly. It was not a threat. It was the warning of someone about to deliver the greatest indictment of her career. Before me today, she said, is a pattern of behavior that did not begin in the few minutes we witnessed this morning, but is the result of years of accumulated, concealed, and enabled abuse of power. Officer Brooks, you did not simply lie to this court. You constructed a system of lying, she signaled. Henderson stepped forward and handed her a file so thick the binding had to be tied shut with string. Alicia opened it, each page, turning with a soft but razor-sharp sound. Every sheet was a buried piece of truth. In 15 years of service, she said clearly, you have been involved in 41 controversial arrests. 85% of those involved people of color. 60% of those cases reported use of force. And in more than 1/3, the cases were dismissed for constitutional violations. A low murmur rippled among court staff. Several people covered their mouths. Turner and Diaz backed away, as if hoping the wall behind them would swallow them whole. Alicia did not look in their direction. She turned to the next page. More than $2.1 million. That is the amount this county has paid to settle lawsuits related to your conduct over the past 10 years. How many families suffered? How many people were humiliated? How many lives were damaged by the same kind of fabricated narrative you attempted to repeat here this morning? Brooks trembled, as if each word Alicia spoke struck directly into his ribs. His breath grew shallow, sweat slid down his spine, but Alicia was not done. She pushed the thick file aside and drew out a thinner envelope stamped with the seal of the Federal Department of Justice. She opened it, removed a single sheet, then lifted her eyes directly to Brooks. "Do you know what is in this, Officer Brooks?" She asked, her voice soft, but cold enough to make the entire room shrink inward. Brooks did not answer. His lips quivered. He was beginning to understand. Alicia placed the document on the bench where everyone could see. "This is an official notice from the Federal Department of Justice. 6 months ago, the Civil Rights Oversight Division launched a confidential investigation into officers suspected of chronic abuse of power. And Officer Brooks, your name is at the top of that list." The courtroom seemed to explode in silence. No one dared to speak, but every pair of eyes shone like a flashlight aimed straight at Brooks's guilt. Alicia continued her tone, slow and deliberate, as if reading fate itself aloud. "Your actions this morning, from racial insults to excessive force, are the final piece the investigation required. You did not simply assault a woman. You assaulted a federal judge on the steps of her own courtroom." Brooks swayed, his eyes widening, as if the blood had drained from his body. He tried to steady himself against the table, but his hand slipped on sweat. A broken, rasping sound escaped him, half plea, half despair. Alicia did not flinch. Her voice turned to steel heated in fire. "And there is one more thing you do not know, Officer Brooks. That confidential investigation, I am the one overseeing it." A gasp burst from the back row. Emily raised both hands to her mouth, eyes widening in disbelief. Sandra Klein stepped back, her face turning pale. Turner and Diaz looked ready to flee the courtroom entirely. Alicia held Brooks's gaze calm but heavier than a collapsing sky. Today you provided the final and perfect evidence needed to end your career of abuse. And justice does not merely acknowledge this. Justice is standing in front of you. She paused. The entire courtroom held its breath. And justice is about to speak. The gavel struck the bench, echoing like thunder at midday, so powerful it made Brooks jolt backward as if struck. The true judgment had begun, and no lie could escape the light Alicia had brought into this room. Part 9 opened in an air so suffocatingly tense, it felt as if the entire courtroom stood at the edge of a cliff, waiting for a single sentence to send everything crashing into the abyss. Alicia Grant sat straight and unwavering on the bench, her hands interlaced before her, the gavel resting to her right, like the emblem of absolute authority. Her eyes no longer simply recognized truth, they were preparing to redefine the fate of the man standing before her. Officer Daniel Brooks tried to remain upright, but he looked like a collapsing shadow, stripped of every ounce of dominance he once wielded to mask the emptiness inside. He had just lived through the greatest collapse of his life, and Alicia knew it. Everyone in the courtroom knew it. Alicia opened the final file. Her voice rose one word at a time, slow, cold, and sharp as a blade. Officer Brooks, she said, I will now read to you the charges this court is considering based on your actions this morning combined with the newly revealed evidence. Brooks's chest heaved violently. He knew what was coming, but he had no way to prepare for it. Alicia continued without pausing for him to gather himself. First assault in the first degree against an unarmed civilian. Second assault against a federal judge in the course of her official duties. Third violation of civil rights under federal law. Fourth perjury committed inside this courtroom, just steps from the very bench you assumed you could manipulate. Each charge landed like a tolling bell, and with each toll, Brooks shrank further, his shoulders caving as if a rotten wall had been tapped lightly and crumbled on its own. Sandra Klein lifted a hand to her forehead, speechless. Emily Rhodes stared at Brooks, feeling as if she were witnessing a crack opening through the system she worked in, one no one had ever dared look at directly. Alicia rose. Her black robe swept with each step, making her appear like a towering shadow of authority, approaching its final mark. Let me make something very clear. She said, her voice no longer icy, but deep and resonant, with the weight of 23 years on the federal bench. You spent 15 years intimidating those you believed were weaker. You relied on their silence. You relied on their innocence. And you relied on a system far too comfortable trusting a badge over the truth. Alicia's eyes burned like fire beneath ice. But this morning, you chose the wrong person. Brooks shuddered. His knees threatened to buckle, but they only trembled helplessly. Every excuse died on his tongue. Alicia continued, her voice rising, controlled but fierce. You thought I was an ordinary woman. You thought I would fear you standing in front of me. You thought your insults could make me shrink. But what you never knew is that I have spent my entire career facing men like you men who believe power is a weapon to strike others with. She placed both hands on the bench, her voice lowering into a tone soft but sharper than steel. And in 23 years I have never lost to a man like that. Brooks stumbled backward, but the prosecution table blocked him. He was trapped. No more paths to escape, no more lies to cling to. Alicia looked directly into him, her gaze cutting through every layer of hypocrisy he had ever worn. Therefore, Officer Brooks, she said, her voice so clear, the entire room held its breath today. This court and I myself will show you what you have forced others to memorize for years. Actions have consequences. Henderson placed a document before her. Alicia signed it swiftly, then lifted it for Brooks to see. This is the official order converting your status from witness to defendant in this very proceeding. Brooks's mouth hung open, but no sound came. His body sagged, his eyes bloodshot with despair. Alicia no longer looked at him. She returned to the bench, sat down, and lifted the gavel between two fingers. The court will recess 10 minutes, she said, to prepare for sentencing. The room shuddered. The gavel struck lightly, yet the sound roared like thunder. In that moment, everyone understood. There would be no escape, no negotiation, no easy forgiveness. The hearing would resume, and when Alicia Grant returned, it would no longer be accusation. It would be judgment. The moment Alicia Grant tapped the gavel and announced the recess, no one in the courtroom had the composure to actually leave. Tension hung in the air, like a thin layer of dust, clinging to every breath and every corner of the room. Those present stood frozen, trying to grasp what they were about to witness: a trial turning itself inside out, and a man who once wore a badge, now forced to face the very person he dared to insult, strike, and humiliate. Officer Brooks could no longer stand upright. He collapsed into the defendant's chair, his hands gripping the edges so tightly, it seemed that if he let go, the truth itself would crush the air from his lungs. The arrogance was gone, the smug confidence erased. All that remained was the shattered shell of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Court staff exchanged looks, some sighing, others unable to meet Alicia's eyes, as if they too felt guilty for having trusted Brooks's lies so easily. Emily Rhodes leaned against the wall near the door, hands pressed to her chest, trying to calm the frantic rhythm of her heartbeat. She understood exactly what was coming. She had worked long enough to know that Alicia Grant never showed mercy when the truth stood fully revealed. The back door opened again, and silence fell instantly. Alicia stepped inside, her black robe flowing with each stride, no longer carrying anger or pain, only the unquestionable authority of justice awakened. Henderson called out, his voice thunderous. The Ridgeview Federal Court is now back in session, presiding the Honorable Judge Alicia Grant. Alicia took her seat, placing the gavel neatly before her. Her gaze swept across the room, and no one dared move. Then she looked directly at Brooks, who now stared at the floor as if simply meeting her eyes would cause him to crumble. Officer Brooks, she said, her voice steady but heavy as stone. This court has reviewed all evidence, testimony, and video related to the events of this morning. The court has reviewed your 15-year service record. The court has also reviewed the impact of your repeated actions on the members of this community. Today, this court will issue its ruling. Alicia did not need to glance at the papers. Every charge had already been engraved into her memory. First, the court finds you guilty of assault in the 1st degree. Second, the court finds you guilty of assaulting a federal judge. Third, the court finds you guilty of violating civil rights under color of law. Fourth, the court finds you guilty of perjury before this court. Brooks collapsed deeper into his seat, breath, sharp eyes reddened. He wanted to plead, but the words died before they could leave his throat. Alicia looked at him without anger, but with the weight of someone who had witnessed too many lives crushed by men like him. For 15 years, he had generated fear in the community. For 15 years, he had wielded the badge as a shield for his actions. But this morning, he had torn that shield off with his own hands. Alicia lifted the gavel, her voice lowering, deep, sharp, and cold. Today, this court will do what should have been done long ago. Officer Brooks, You are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. At that moment, a choked sob burst from Brooks. Emily closed her eyes, and Sandra Klein covered her mouth. No one objected. No one doubted the fairness of the ruling. Alicia rose and stepped away from the bench, not giving Brooks a single additional glance. Her final words were not for him, but for everyone in the room, for an entire system that had grown far too accustomed to its own decay. Actions carry a price. And today, this system reminds you of that fact not through words, but through justice. The gavel struck one last time, the sound echoing like the end of an era and the beginning of something new. A chapter where justice would no longer be buried beneath lies wearing the shape of a badge. And in that moment, no one had any doubt. Alicia Grant had not merely reclaimed her position, she had redefined it. Justice was no longer an abstract ideal. Justice had risen. Justice had spoken. And through the hands of a woman once underestimated, justice had returned to its rightful place. What happens when a police officer abuses his power in front of the wrong person? This dramatic true-style story follows Judge Alicia Grant, a respected federal judge who arrives at the courthouse in plain clothes only to be assaulted, humiliated, and falsely accused by an officer who sees her as nothing more than another nobody. But moments later, everything changes. This video reveals the shocking courtroom reversal that exposes years of corruption, systemic misconduct, and unchecked authority. Filled with high stakes, tension, powerful twists, and an emotional final blow, this is a story about justice pushing back with full force. If you believe accountability matters, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this story so more people can see how quickly power collapses when the truth steps forward. Keywords: police misconduct, courtroom twist, judge reveals identity justice, story corruption exposed, dramatic storytelling, true justice, power abuse, emotional courtroom scene.